So of all the things a builder has to master, detailing is probably the hardest, but not quite for the reason you'd expect. So the way I'm going to show you this is by having one side being the wrong way to do it and one side being the right way. So obviously we're going to start with the wrong way. Now, many of you might see this as a good way of detailing, but it's not. Over-detailing is when you spam slabs, trapdoors, and all this stuff, making really fancy things, but it fills up the whole wall. Often, going simpler is the better way to do it. And the reason that is because it gets rid of all the depth. And I'm going to show you this again, because I can. You see, I decided to make an extremely nice pattern and all that, but when it comes to realism, how realistic that is, no, not many houses have such intricate things. Not only that, but it removes all the depth that you had spent all that time making. It's completely pointless. And taking this even further, sometimes making, even if it's not super, detailed, which, even though this one is, I'm still using it as an example, sometimes a simpler option is the better one. As in this case, instead of using some fancy way of doing it, I'm just carving out a window and adding the top. But also, that doesn't mean it's the only way to do it. You see, with this one, I'm going with the simpler option. I'm doing something really simple, but the size just doesn't feel right. It's not, accurate. It's not something that you would see normally. It just doesn't feel right, especially the shaping, everything like that. And even though I wasn't able to get something I liked and just had to keep messing with this, and frankly nothing good came out of this part, just because going simpler often works better doesn't mean that's the only choice. Especially on bigger walls usually need more detailing or more things to sort of make them look better or more interesting. And now I do want to say this is a bad example. I'm not too proud of what I did with this wall here, so don't really copy much off of this. But if you get an idea, just try it out. See, even though I did break a few rules here, I wasn't quite aware of it, and even though I did fix it after a bit, I shouldn't have used it. But if it had ended up working out, I would have used it, and there's still always that small chance that it will work. So, you gotta experiment. See, experimenting is the one thing that made us all know what works and what doesn't. That's how everything goes. If you don't experiment, you'll never get anything new. So experimenting is probably one of the most important things for not only detailing, but for everything else. See, I have a ton of different thoughts for how I could have done this that probably would have worked, but since I was on a time limit, I didn't quite do it. Now, a quick little thing is that you don't have to use windows for wall detailing. It's pretty simple. But I'll do a separate type of detailing. I'm just going to call it for now framing, or frame detailing, just because you're more detailing the outer edges, basically everything except for the wall. Now, this is much easier to let loose on, and frankly, there's a lot less risk doing it because you're still adding depth, but doing it too much brings the other problem with over-detailing into play, and that is making it look too busy. See, when you're making builds, when you're trying to make it look aesthetically pleasing, you want to make it as digestible as possible. And adding just a ton of details, just a bunch of stuff to distract you from the entire build, then it just becomes hard to look at. It becomes hard to understand the whole thing, see the whole building instead of just that one specific part. And while segmenting houses or parts of houses into separate areas, that's a good idea, because then it's just easier to tell what is what, like what this specific part of the house is. You don't want to be confused at what part is the roof and what part is, the wall. And while that would certainly make for an interesting house, interesting doesn't always mean better. In fact, depending on what people consider interesting, that will eventually end up making the house just super complicated, and you won't be able to really just understand what the house is supposed to look like, because there's just too much going on. And bringing in another problem, or actually two problems that I can think of right now, is that it'll not only make it feel incredibly heavy. See, there's two types of depth that you can mess with. There's additive and subtractive, or something similar to that. Additive is when you add stuff on to make the depth. And subtractive is when you go in a layer, or sort of get rid of stuff, or something like that. See, when you're making a build, there's like a balance that you want to maintain, or make sort of, balanced. If you add too much detailing to one side, that's going to unbalance that side. You're going to have to add an equal amount of something to the other. And this doesn't even go for detailing, this just goes for everything in building. And while the second point sort of does tie into the same thing, if you do too much detailing to one part, again, that's going to unbalance it, but it's going to make you focus on that one part in particular, when you would normally want to focus on the entire build. And now going on to the right side, back when I mentioned we were messing with the shape, I meant it. So instead of just trying to add detail to the roof or the shape, try messing with the shape, which again would add more depth. That's what I did with the roof here. It ends up with a much cleaner and frankly just a better design overall. And honestly, it really does give a charm that otherwise could not have been found if I had just sticked with adding things instead of messing with them. And coming back to the additive and subtractive depth, you can see it starts out almost exactly the same, but instead this time I'm going with the bottom with the additive, which would give it like a heavier feel, and the top is going to have a light feeling. And I know I messed up with the stairs right there. It really annoyed me when doing the replay file and all that, but I fixed it in a bit. What that does is it not only makes the bottom feel like more of a foundation and like it's actually physically able to lift this up, but it also maintains the original weight and balance of the build. By adding depth to the bottom and subtracting depth to the top, you're kind of balancing out the amount of depth added and subtracted. That just roughly equals 0. It doesn't have to be exact, because obviously maybe changing the balance a little bit can help. And while the starting usually feels the same, that's just normal. Starting out with a similar style to over detailing is because the over detailing usually starts out simple and just continues to add more and more and more, whereas with this, you just want to keep it simple, maybe add more, or even add less. That could help too, because again, you want to make this build as digestible as possible. You want to be able to tell what everything is, and sometimes too much detail can really get in the way of that, and for me often has, actually. Because another quick problem with over detailing, it makes you focus more on the patterns and more on the things you detail than the entire build again, and doing that just isn't helping with the whole situation. In fact, it's doing the exact opposite. So for a quick takeaway, or one of the biggest things you should learn from this whole detailing thing, is that detailing is focused on adding depth as much as you can, or at least within reasonable amounts, and making sure that the whole thing is actually becoming one, and so that it's digestible and easy to look at. But I'm going to start working on a quick little front of a house or something that I'm actually going to use in my thumbnail, just to show you exactly how I would do this in just one go. See, I would build this sort of face, and normally it would just be the entire shape palette and all that figured out, and then I would just start adding to the frames a little bit, adding things that would give it extra depth, maybe more interests. I could have done this better by switching up the palettes a little bit of the detailing to make it more visible, instead of, honestly with this, barely visible at all. And then I decided to add the windows, but with the top one, there was no subtractive depth, and the top felt unbalanced, like it could topple at any second, so I had to go in one layer and change the block palette, which is just a little fake sort of depth thing, which adds on to the normal depth, which not only adds depth and fixes the balance, but also gives it sort of the feeling that the windows are on the exact same layer. and all that. But overall, we've learned that over-detailing sucks, and that building is, again, basically purely up to, or detailing, sorry, messed up right there, is basically purely up to adding depth in a way that looks interesting. That's basically my best definition for it, I guess. Now, if you've made it to the end, that means you've enjoyed watching and you've most likely learned something from it. But if you do have anything else you would like to learn, make sure to comment it. I would love to read your comments, plus it helps the algorithm, so it's always nice. Also, if you want to see more of these things, make sure to subscribe and like the video because apparently that helps too. See ya, have a good day.